Hi, I am Dr. Stephanie Brenner from Compass PD. In honor of Dyslexia Awareness Month, I thought I would share with you my top 5 tips for educators and families who are working with students who are dyslexic. So, over the next 5 days, I'll share one tip a day, and you'll need to stick with me till the end to get all of the good nuggets. So, today's tip number 1, is that we need to protect and nourish the soul of a child. And what that means in practice is that as the parent or educator of a student or students with dyslexia, it is our job to be purposely searching for ways to highlight a student's successes and highlight their strengths. It is so easy for us to focus on the things that are challenging for students who are dyslexic, or even for us to focus on the growth that they are not making, that we forget we're talking about a child. And we need to highlight their successes and strengths as much as possible. So even if it's a small, little, tiny thing, it might seem that way to us, but for the student or the child, it's probably a really big deal. So the student and the children who are dyslexic need to know there is a person in their life who is always on the lookout for celebrating those successes and celebrating their strengths, and making sure that everyone around them is doing the same thing. So tip number 1 is for us to always be the person who is protecting and nourishing the soul of a child. Hi, I'm Dr. Stephanie Brenner from Compass PD, and I'm here to share tip number 2 out of my top 5 tips for families and educators who are working with students with dyslexia. Tip number 2 is that we keep in mind the long-term view. What I mean when I say that is it's easy for us to get caught up in that today's hard, tomorrow's probably going to be hard, and even that we're probably not going to be at grade level at the end of this year, or maybe not even at the end of next school year. And that's okay. It's okay because right now you're doing the hard work necessary so that when you're older, you're able to still do all of the things that you want to do in life. And that's an important mindset for us as the adults to keep in place so that our students then have that mindset that right now I'm doing the hard work necessary so that when I'm older, I have the skills and I have the coping techniques and the strategies that help me be able to be successful in whatever it is that I want to do in my lifetime. So that is tip number 2 out of my top 5 tips, and I will see you next time with tip number 3. And I'm here with tip number 3 out of my top 5 tips for families and educators who are working with students with dyslexia. Tip number 3 is that we start accommodations and interventions as early as possible. We do not need to wait for a diagnosis of dyslexia in order to do something, and to do something early. The data is really clear that as early as kindergarten and first grade, there is already an achievement gap present between students who are dyslexic and students who are not dyslexic. That means we can be confident in knowing that relying on... Hi, I'm Dr. Stephanie Brenner from Compass PD, and I'm here to share tip number 4 out of my top 5 tips for families and educators who are working with students with dyslexia. Tip number 4 is to focus on the strengths. It's really easy as educators and even families to focus on all the things that a child isn't able to do. And in fact, what makes dyslexia so unique is that it's often that the child does so many things well, but there's this one part of their life where it doesn't make sense that everything is so challenging. And it just happens to be reading, writing, and spelling, and speaking at times as well. So as a parent or as an educator of a student who is dyslexic, it's really important for us to focus on what Sally Shaywitz calls the sea of strengths, so that we are noticing and highlighting all of the things that the child or adult does well, so that when we're deciding on what kinds of accommodations, what kinds of supports and interventions we're putting in place, that we can start there and build up the child. And even from a social emotional aspect, when thinking about tip number 1, protect and nourish the soul of a child, having a strength-based mindset is really key to that process and that idea as well. So tip number 4 is to really always focus on the strengths. I will see you next time for tip number 5. Hi, this is Dr. Stephanie Brenner from Compass PD, and I'm here with tip number 5 of my top 5 tips for families and educators who are working with students with dyslexia. And tip number 5 is that in all of the planning we do, we never forget that all of the difficulties students are experiencing are rooted in that core phonological deficit. So when we're deciding what kinds of accommodations students might need, when we're deciding what kinds of interventions a student might need, that we need to always remember that it goes back to the ability to hear and say sounds in our language. So what is also important about that idea is that how that deficit shows itself over the lifespan of a child changes. So how that deficit looks in a kindergartner or preschooler looks different than even a elementary student and a high schooler or an adult. So don't forget that core phonological deficit when doing all of your planning. So that's tip number 5. And I'm so glad that you've joined me in this journey of my top 5 tips. Thank you.